Hello, everybody. This is chapter 6. So, we're going to be talking about how do we get energy from food. So, we start by just eating, right? That's where we're going to start. We're eventually going to go, how when sugar gets into your bloodstream and then gets into your cell, but we got to start somewhere, right? Now, when you're eating and chewing, what you're doing is you're breaking that food mechanically down, and your saliva is actually an enzyme that will start working on that food. It'll start to chemically change that food. Now, it's passed into the stomach, and in the stomach then is where enzymes start to break it down. Now we think about stomach acid as this thing that like melts metal and melts stuff when it gets spilled. That's not really how acid works. Your stomach acid is only about the pH or the same acidity as like lemon juice. And but what's really important are the enzymes in there that work better at low pH. And this is one of the places where we kill bacteria, right? All that bacteria on our food gets killed here. So I should mention that a human stomach is 50 milliliters. That's, a very small amount, maybe the size of like a golf ball. But a human stomach can be filled up to 2 to 4 liters, somewhere depending on the size of the person, right? If you're only 5 foot tall, you can't eat as much as some guy who is 7 feet tall, right? So, what we see then is like predators have bigger stomachs that can expand greatly. This cheetah here just chilling out, just ate, a big meal of some sort of antelope meat probably, and is chilling out there digesting its food, because they want to be able to gorge because they don't know when their next meal is coming, potentially. As food then gets broken down chemically in the stomach, it gets into the small intestine, orange thing here. It's a long 20-foot tube where this is where like digestion actually happens. This is where the carbs, the lipids, the amino acids are absorbed into the blood. Now, the villi are these small, tiny projections that come out from the edge of the skin, or sorry, not the skin, the inside of the tube of the small intestine. And what it does is it makes it 300 square meters, right? That's about, think about, the tube is only 20 feet long, right? And it's not that, like, thick, maybe about as big around as your fingers or maybe your thumb. But it has 300 square meters of surface area. That's like the length of a football field, and then about 3 meters, about 9 feet by the length of a football field. So that's a huge area that these villi allow, which allows for a lot of surface area for the blood for the small intestine to absorb those carbs, lipids, and amino acids into the blood. Then, as it exits the small intestine, it goes into the large intestine. That's right here, the green one, right? And what's happening then is the point of the large intestine is to concentrate that waste, absorb the water, so you can poop something out that isn't just like totally liquid, right? There's also bacteria in this large intestine that will be using that waste, essentially breaking it down and creating a lot of the vitamins, a lot of the B vitamins. Vitamin K, the exclusive source of vitamin K that we have, is actually from the bacteria that are growing in our gut. If you look in the back of like a vitamin bottle, you'll never see vitamin K there. It's just not put in because we get enough of it from our gut bacteria. The only time that you might get some vitamin K is babies. When babies are born, their colon is sterile, right? There's no bacteria there. And vitamin K is really, really important for what do I want to say? For blood clotting, yeah. So babies sometimes, if they don't get, they can have blood clotting disorders if they don't have enough vitamin K. So we oftentimes give them a vitamin K shot, and that allows for time for bacteria to colonize that large intestine. So, we've pooped out our waste, right? But there's also a lot of other organisms, the pancreas and the liver, that produce enzymes that help us break down fats and proteins. So, as those amino acids and lipids and carbohydrates have already been put into the blood, what happens then is they're transported all throughout the body. And those cells then absorb that sugar, absorb those carbs and the lipids through their membranes. So we're going to basically concentrate on sugar here now. The main sugar we're going to be talking about is glucose. We call glucose the basic carbohydrate of biology, basically because, sucrose, the sugar that you eat in cookies or, your normal sugar, is essentially turned into glucose before the rest of your body, uses it, before your cells use it. So, when we're going to be talking about respiration, we're going to be talking about two types of respiration. Aerobic respiration, which is respiration in the presence of oxygen, and anaerobic respiration, which is the breakdown of sugar without the presence of oxygen. Okay? Now, what we see is that aerobic respiration creates 38 ATPs from one glucose, whereas anaerobic respiration creates 2 ATPs from one glucose. So when you're running or jogging at a slow pace, you have enough oxygen in the muscles that, your leg muscles, basically, the main muscles you're using when you're running. But if you're lifting weights super, super hard, let's say this guy, he's, doing some sort of lift where he's using his triceps and his shoulder muscles probably here. What he can do is locally run those muscles right here in his arms out of oxygen. So those muscles then need to do anaerobic respiration. And that essentially uses more energy. It doesn't use more energy. It uses up more sugar. So you might think about aerobic respiration as using a car that goes 38 miles per gallon. Whereas anaerobic respiration is a car that goes 2 miles per gallon. Now, if your goal is to lose weight, which is essentially use energy, use up sugar in your body, you want to use the car that gets 2 miles per gallon. Do anaerobic respiration, do hard weightlifting and sprinting, and you'll lose weight quicker. You'll use up that energy quicker, and it burns that sugar quicker, so you can lose weight more quickly that way. Now, we're going to be calling this cellular respiration, which is we're going to be concentrating on aerobic respiration, which is the harvesting of chemical energy from organic fuel molecules. Now, we're harvesting energy from this peanut. This peanut is being burned, and it's this, there's oxygen in the air around it, and it's being broken down into its base chemicals. The thing is, this is a one-step process when you light it on fire. You can't take a peanut and essentially light it on fire in your body. You need to do a metabolic pathway, so it's not just one step. So there's 3 steps to cellular respiration, and they take place in different areas. Glycolysis happens outside the mitochondria, whereas the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain happens inside a mitochondrion. So you start out with glucose, and really what the whole point of this process is to take the energy from glucose to create ATP. So we take the energy from glucose and take ADP and another P and put on that third P to create ATP. So the first step is glycolysis, which is taking a sugar and cutting it. Now this is happening in the cytoplasm of the cell. You start off with glucose and you need to invest a little bit of energy, 2 ATPs, and what you get out of it is 4 ATPs, so it's a net plus 2. But, already we've doubled the amount of ATP that we have, so that's good, right? Invest 2, get 4, not a bad thing. Now we're getting this pyruvic acid, but don't really pay attention to that. Glycolysis is really highlighted when adrenaline gets released. If you've ever had like a car accident or something and you get really shaky and it's like basically you have a ton of energy, and this is this classic example of like the mom who's 5'0" lifts up a car and pulls her kid out from underneath the car, right? Now at any other time she wouldn't be able to do that, but how does a 5'0" woman lift up a car? Well, it's adrenaline. Adrenaline comes in and gets released throughout all of the body. And what it does is it makes a ton of glycolysis happen. And what happens then, there's a huge release of energy. If all of your sugar all of a sudden goes through glycolysis all at the same time, you create actually a lot of ATP. A lot of that energy that your body can use. Now the shakes that you get after you have a car accident are your body trying to get rid of all of that energy. Because it doesn't necessarily have something to do with it. So there's other effects with adrenaline, like dilation of the eyes and the blood vessels and the breathing pathways and stuff. But that's all, basically getting you ready to fight or flight. All right, so let's then go into what we've got is the pyruvic acids, and we go into the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. Now this is happening inside the mitochondrion. Mitochondrion is singular, mitochondria is plural. So what we say is this, we get inputs and what comes out of it, I don't really want to go through the steps of the citric acid cycle for you. That's not important for you to know. But what I do want you to know is what comes out of it is ATP and carbon dioxide. Now you might realize, I recognize carbon dioxide. That is what we're breathing out. We're breathing out this carbon dioxide. This is where that gas comes from. Now, let's then move on to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is by far the most productive in terms of ATP process that we have. What we should think about is the mitochondria having 2 membranes. Now there's this space between the membranes in the mitochondria, which is called the intermembrane space. Now that membrane on the inside is acting like a dam, okay? And what we're going to do is pump hydrogen ions from inside the mitochondrion to this intermembrane space, and that's on this next picture here. What we're doing is we've basically gone through the citric acid cycle, and we use these products of the citric acid cycle to pump hydrogen ions up. Now, if we want to think of this as like a reservoir, a lake with a reservoir, and there's a dam right here, what happens is that these hydrogen ions there's a higher concentration of hydrogen ions, and this is kind of why we talked about diffusion last chapter. They want to diffuse across this membrane because there's not a lot of hydrogen down here. So it's kind of like water wanting to travel downhill through the turbine of a hydroelectric dam. Now the turbine, in this case, is ATP synthase. It's this enzyme where the hydrogen ion literally passes through this hole. It literally turns something. The energy is harvested, and that's the energy that we use to attach the P to the ADP to create ATP. as that hydrogen ion goes through this thing, we harvest that energy, that like kinetic energy, to glue on that third P to make ATP. So what we say is this this inner membrane then is like the dam, and this intermembrane space is the reservoir holding back all those hydrogen ions. Now the reason why this is all then folded up is it because it allows for more places to put this ATP synthase enzyme. So there is kind of like a little overview here where we have ATP production. What happens? We get 2 ATPs from glycolysis, 2 from the citric acid cycle, and 34 from the electron transport chain, making 38. Now these aren't perfect processes. It doesn't always get, particularly in the electron transport chain, some of these hydrogens escape or make it through the membrane without going through the ATP synthase. So 38 or 34 in the electron transport chain are rarely produced, but it's, under a perfect conditions, that's what we would expect. Now, when we get to anaerobic respiration, this is a little different, right? So we're kind of done with aerobic respiration. What anaerobic respiration is how our body essentially uses sugar when there's not enough oxygen around. So this isn't like your whole body running out of oxygen, right? That would mean you would die, right? But when you're sprinting as fast as you can, your leg muscles might run out of oxygen. And for a short amount of time, that's no big deal, because we can go through this thing called anaerobic respiration or fermentation. And it's kind of like glycolysis. It's just a little different. And what we get out of it is 2 ATPs and lactic acid. Now that lactic acid is that acid that makes your muscles hurt, after a hard workout. And it takes a while for your body to get rid of that lactic acid, and that's why it stays kind of in the muscles. Now microorganisms undergo fermentation, but they do it a little differently. They don't produce lactic acid, so yeast produces ethyl alcohol, the ethanol or the alcohol that is in beer, wine, or vodka. Now, you might see that, essentially the ethanol, the alcohol, is like yeast pee, right? It's essentially a waste product. And the yeast itself, when you make wine or champagne or something, right? What you do is you take grape juice, which is essentially sugar water, add yeast to it, and then you let it grow. In the champagne bottle, it uses up all the oxygen, and then it goes to this fermentation process, and then we make alcohol. The thing is, the highest level of wine or champagne of alcohol that you can have is around 15%. They will essentially, the yeast will stop growing when the alcohol content gets beyond 15%. Then what we see is the bubbles produced in champagne is the CO2. It just gets dissolved in the water, and then when you open it and release the pressure, those CO2 bubbles come out. And that's in like fancy beer that you would drink too. Unfortunately, things like Bud Light and Natty Ice or whatever, they just have CO2 injected into it at the last step of the brewing process. It's not the yeast that is putting in the CO2. Now the same thing happens in bread, right? The yeast, when you put together a dough with some water and some yeast and some flour, those yeasts in that dough run out of oxygen, and then they start taking the sugars from the flour and producing carbon dioxide, and that's the rising of the bread that you get. That's why bread rises. And yes, alcohol is produced in bread, but it usually gets boiled off in the baking process. Now, as we then get to photosynthesis, what I want to talk about is how respiration and photosynthesis kind of link up together. Respiration is chemical energy using chemical energy for other forms of energy, right? So when you eat sugar, you turn it into kinetic energy as you run around. Now, this is the energy, or who is doing this? Well, fungi, animals, and bacteria. But plants too. Plants use sugar for energy. It's just that they made their own sugar, right? So plants are doing plants are doing respiration. The thing is, only plants and certain bacteria are doing photosynthesis, where this is taking light energy and turning that light energy into chemical energy. Now, producers are doing this, like plants and cyanobacteria. There are, you could kind of say that this is kind of like what chemoautotrophic bacteria, those deep sea bacteria, are doing, but they're not taking light energy, they're actually taking chemical energy to make sugars. Now, if you look at the chemical equations for respiration, right? We've looked at this before, where we take glucose and oxygen, and what we get out of it is carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Now, this energy for us is that ATP, or for anything, is that ATP, right? We eat sugar and we breathe in oxygen. What we do then is we breathe out carbon dioxide, we use the energy, and then we either keep that water or just like pee out that water, right? Now look at glucose plus oxygen equals CO2, water, and energy. Look at this. CO2, water, and energy equals glucose and oxygen. And essentially what we see is that this energy is ATP energy. This energy is light energy. And then what we get then is the same products and reactants. So you take the products of respiration and put it as the reactants for photosynthesis. And this is essentially how ecosystems recycle things, right? The waste products that animals create are used by plants, and the waste products that plants use are used by animals and bacteria. And this is happening, across the ecosystem. All right, that's it for chapter 6. See you later.